We come to the 20th session. In a way, the last session, in a way, a second last session. Last from the Sutra point of view. Yoga Sutras is a book of 196 sutras, and we will be completing till 196 all the sutras in this session. I plan to take one more session on Yoga Sutras, giving a psychoanalytic commentary in general. Till now, I have confined myself to from sutra to sutra. Now, an overall commentary from a psychoanalytic standpoint. That will be session 21. So let us go into the 20th session, the last part of the fourth part, Kaivalya Pad of Yoga Sutras. So let us see what Patanjali says. Patanjali gets here into the philosophy of the mind. He says, if the mind was like a mirror, it could observe itself, but that would lead to an infinite regress, resulting in confusion of mind and memory. And here we have to bring in Immanuel Kant and psychoanalysis. In 181, Patanjali says, it's very difficult for mind to observe itself. Rather, the Purusha observes the mind. The question then is, does Purusha have an independent thinking capability? Or does it use the thinking capability of mind, but from an observer status? It looks more feasible that the Purusha is using the thinking capability of the mind to reflect upon the mind. The question here is of, if the mind was like a mirror and it could see itself exactly the way the Purusha sees it, then the seer would become object for an other seer and the infinite regress would go on. And that would lead to a confusion of mind and memory. So nature has created a mind which observes objects but not itself. And here Immanuel Kant comes in, where he talks about the process of knowing, where space, time, and causality are modes of perception. They are not the perceived, they are the modes of perception. And there cannot be any perception without these modes of perception innately applied into the knowing process. And because of this, it is impossible to reflect upon the elementals which are involved as elementals in the perception process, because the perception process happens only when these elementals come to work. But before they have all come together to work, if each of the elemental is independent, then a perception process is not possible, and therefore the mind cannot know itself fully, because the knowing process demands that elementals come together. And it's only when the elementals come together and operate that what we call mind is in operation. And therefore, the elementals that constitute the mind cannot be known by the mind because they are pre the knowing process. Similarly, we cannot jump beyond the limit of these elementals which are involved in the perceptual process, because the limit of these elementals is the limit of our knowing. So the thing in itself of Kant cannot be known. Psychoanalysis is yet to put all these things into psychoanalysis. Whole of epistemology is out of psychoanalysis. Philosophy of the mind is yet to be brought into psychoanalysis. I have one presentation on a full school of psychoanalysis, half school, 3/4 school, and a quarter school, where I have discussed psychoanalytic schools with a philosophy, without a philosophy, with a model of the mind, without a model of the mind. So Patanjali here talks about an infinite regress, to avoid which nature has not allowed mind to know itself the way it knows any other object. And there is also an epistemological limitation on it, that knowing happens after an epistemological process happens. And that epistemological process involves some elementals. Those who are interested can go into Immanuel Kant. And before these elementals come together under the influence of certain forces and start acting together to start the process of knowing, these elementals cannot be known. In fact, nothing can be known. There is no way we can short circuit, we can leap the process of knowing. Now, the challenge here to Kantian epistemology comes from Indian spirituality, that there are other ways of knowing apart from the process which Kant has described. And I have talked about a different type of knowing as elaborated in Indian spirituality in some others YouTube discussion. You can go there if you're interested. But this is what Patanjali is saying, that essentially the Purusha has to look at the mind. The mind cannot look at itself with as much of felicity as it can look at any other object. When the chitta comes to rest, the innate structure and contents of one's mind can be known. And this takes a long time of spiritual preparation. Only after desires and fears have been considerably worked upon, that intermittently chitta comes to a rest. And on demand, even intermittently, it does not come to the rest on demand. Initially, it comes to rest on itself and gets lost into activity again by itself. Slowly, it comes on demand, but very small periods before one can make it the new normal. But whenever it comes to a rest for a reasonable time, then the innate structure and contents of one's mind can be known. One can, in psychoanalytic sense, delve deeper into the preconscious and the unconscious, for which the silence of the conscious mind is a prerequisite. And the silence of the conscious mind demands that some purification happen in the chitta, because the non-silence of the conscious mind is only a reflection of non-purification in the chitta. And we can see psychoanalytically also, when the unconscious gets worked upon, purified of the complexes, the conscious mind is more peaceful. The mind which sees the seer and the seen fulfills all its purposes. So the mind where there is an active Purusha, the seer of the seer. So when you have an active Purusha who can see the observing ego and the participating ego both. Psychoanalysis talks only about the two, participating ego, observing ego, but there is a third position, that Purusha, that observer who can see even the observing ego. Then when such a state can be continued on demand for a reasonable time, slowly and gradually mind fulfills all its purposes of evolution and ultimately getting into a state of no thought. And then deciding what to do. No thought does not mean you remain in no thought for the rest of your life. You decide how much time to be in a state of no thought, how much time to be in a state of thought, and when to be in a state of thought, for what purpose, focused on what area and objectives. The mind, through imprinted with multiple tendencies and experiences, has a purpose other than that of experiences, given the nature of the being who employs the mind. So the mind is usually in a million desires all the time, has undertaken million experiences of this birth and other births. But Patanjali says, despite all of it, despite all the load of experiences and the load of the unconscious, essentially, the purpose of mind is not only experiences. Experiences is one purpose, definitely so. But there is another purpose of the mind, which is evolution. To get out of these experiences into a freedom of the state of no thought, no affect, no feelings, no thoughts, although the feeling of bliss is there, except for in certain states of Kaivalya where you have only pure consciousness. So he says, although the mind is loaded with million experiences, million memories, million traumas, yet the purpose of the mind is not only these experiences, but also a purpose to be free of these compulsive activities and go into a state of samadhi or kaivalya. So the mind has two purposes: experiences and freedom from experiences. Initially it is into experiences. After some time it goes into pursuit of freedom from these compulsive experiences, and then once the freedom is attained, you pick and choose experiences. Complete understanding leads to cessation of the sense of self and mental activities arising therefrom. When one goes deep into the state of samadhi, the sense of self goes away, the I-ness goes away, one dissolves into the ocean of consciousness. One gets into that oceanic state, a spiritual oceanic state. And that leads to cessation of the sense of self and mental activities that arise from the sense of self. So this is experiential. Unless you experience that, you cannot second that this indeed is true. But this is a goal state of many spiritual schools, also of Patanjali. It is then that the mind is inclined to due discernment of knowledge and kaivalya happens. Only after you achieve oneness with existence, first state of no thought and oneness with existence, that true discernment, true knowledge, true kaivalya, true samadhi happens. Any lapses in discrimination will reactivate ordinary activities of the mind based on latent content of the mind, unconscious, latent content of the unconscious. So even after you are established in samadhi, after some time when that state ends and ordinary activities reactivate, the latent unconscious will again come up till you really purify the unconscious and you bring the light of that state of samadhi into the whole of your personality. So even after you achieve a state of no thought, the whole personality is not purified. Even after you experience a psychic, the whole personality is not purified. Even after you achieve oneness with existence, the whole personality is not purified. That purification work still goes on. In certain rare cases, with that experience, the whole being gets purified, but in most cases it does not. So the work still goes on and the ordinary activities will restart, but now their force will be reduced because these rare experiences do bring about enduring changes, enduring purifications. May not be 100%, but some extent. Sorry. The process to overcome these lapses is the same as one discussed before to overcome the obstacles. What he said before, to overcome obstacles, the same tools apply to overcome this deviation into ordinariness after experiencing samadhi. When one is not entangled with the highest states of attainments, discernment then is called dharma megha samadhi, that liberates one from one's very nature. Even after experiencing samadhi, the ego can take hold of that experience for its own gratification. And one can develop high ego arrogance because one has experienced those states. Because it is possible that the ego and the sense of power The drive for power may not have been purified even after that experience. In that case, that drive for power can capture that experience also and make it into a tool for its own gratification. So Patanjali says, one should not get entangled even with these highest states of attainments. And one who has experienced these states and after experiencing is not entangled and continues to be in a state of samadhi, then such a state of samadhi he calls dharma megha samadhi. And this state that you experience samadhi, come back to normalcy. But even when you are come back to normalcy, your ego does not use the experience of samadhi for its own gratification. You are not entangled even with the state of samadhi. You are not addicted to it. You don't use it for any sort of gratification, to score points over others or become a religious guru or get money from people or obedience from people. If you are not entangled with the highest of states, and then again you go back into samadhi, that samadhi can be called as dharma megha samadhi, where despite the samadhi, you are not entangled with it and you don't use it for any other ordinary purpose. And this kind of going into samadhi and existing without samadhi also liberates one from one's very nature, one's ordinary nature of becoming. It liberates one from one's ordinary desires, the strange hold of ordinary desires. This realization annihilates both causes of suffering and the operative laws of cause and effect. So this kind of realization, experiencing a state of samadhi, not being entangled into it, not using it for any ordinary purpose, but sincerely being in that state of samadhi again and again, that realization annihilates the suffering and ordinary law of cause and effect, the ordinary karma which are there. Karma are thought of to be of three types. The lightest of karma which can be overcome with little effort, moderately strong karma which can be overcome with slightly strong efforts, strong karma which can be overcome only with strong efforts, and most people will not be able to make that strong effort. So for them, the strongest of karma has to be lived out in terms of the consequences. But he says, if you get into this samadhi, all the three kinds of karmas, whatever are remaining, they cease to take effect. This is true in most cases. In some cases, the strongest of karma, the bottom part of it, the most sticky part of it may still have to be lived out. And often it is lived out in terms of some sickness. And we can see that in Osho, we can see that in Ramakrishna Paramhans, we can see that in Yoganand Paramhans, that these kind of experiences annihilated their suffering, annihilated much of the karmic load, but the bottom part, the stickiest part of the karmic load, they had to live it out. Then all coverings and impurities covering the concealed truth are removed. One gets a vast insight, and there remains little to be known. So with that kind of realization stabilizing, that kind of purity instituting itself in the being, truth comes out, the light of truth comes out, and all the essential knowledge comes to us. Little remains to be known. By little, what we mean is, in terms of essential knowledge, little remains to be known. In terms of comprehensive knowledge, of course, it always remains to be known. Nobody can have comprehensive knowledge. Then once their purpose is fulfilled, the gunas stop their ceaseless transformation and come to a rest. Once the desire comes to a rest, the primary fear comes to a rest, the I-ness comes to a rest, then the gunas, the qualities of sattva, rajas and tamas, when they are not used as ceaselessly as before, slowly they also come to a rest. slowly senses also come to a rest. Not only gunas, even senses come to a rest. And once they come to a rest, this is where we say the nature, it shared in those words, nature starts helping sadhana rather than opposing sadhana. Till then, nature is opposing sadhana. But once the gunas and the senses start coming to a rest, we say the nature thereafter helps the sadhana rather than oppose the sadhana. Then because of this, the spiritual states become natural. It's a new normal. Once this ceaseless transformation stops, what appeared as a ceaseless movement is seen as a collection of discrete movements. One can here go to U.G. Krishnamurti, who says that we see cause and effect as connected, but actually they are discrete. So the question appears that how do they appear connected to millions and millions of people for thousands of years? So there is a mystery here that the psychic apparatus does not operate the same way when it operates in the ordinary situation in you and me, and when it operates after these transformations. The apparatus itself undergoes some transformations. And Patanjali says, what appeared to be a ceaseless movement of cause and effect, or the movement of perception, the stimulus and the perception, these movements now appear discrete. And these movements are joined together by our mind. It is mind which is creating this unison in otherwise discrete movements. So this is a state which psychoanalysis, of course, does not talk about. Same with gunas, the psychoanalysis does not go so deep. This is spiritual, psychoanalysis does not go here. And then what happens once the discrete movements are seen? Which means the mind is at a very deep states of rest. Then what happens? Kaivalyam happens. Kaivalya is a state of pure consciousness where all elementals move without any desire guiding them. And Chitta Shakti, the power of consciousness as a state, is established, and one is in one's real self. So the goal of Samadhi, the goal of Kaivalya is attained. And as I said, there are various forms of Samadhi. Kaivalya is one. It's a state of pure consciousness, so pure that in deepest of Kaivalya states, even bliss is not felt. Even the fact that heightened awareness exists is not felt. And as one comes out of Kaivalya, the first state is high state of awareness is felt, then bliss is felt. And then one goes into an observer status, and then we can engage with the mind and then engage with the world. So in a state of Kaivalya, all the elementals are moving without any desire. There is no desire to live, there is no desire to have pleasure, and yet the body performs its functions. The unconscious mind performs some of its functions, but all these elementals are moving about without any desire or fear behind them, which usually is not the case. Usually it is desire or fear behind them. So all the elementals are moving. For example, the photon is, the light is hitting the eyes, going to the brain, but there is no purpose to interpret it. It may get interpreted, may not get interpreted. It must move around freely in the system. So the system works because all the elementals are moving about without any desire or fear guiding them, any desire guiding them. So all the elementals that make up our system are working freely according to the fundamental laws of nature. But there is no desire guiding all of them. They are all free. And we are also free. And in that state, we are established in one's real self. And it is also called a state of Chitta Shakti, where we realize that consciousness is a power. This pure consciousness also is a power. There is also not only an existence aspect, awareness aspect, bliss aspect, knowledge aspect, but also a power aspect. In fact, knowledge is one of the power manifestations. So this is the state of Kaivalya. It is attained. And so with this, Patanjali completes his Yoga Sutras. 4 chapters. First chapter, definition of Samadhi and states of Samadhi or near to Samadhi. Second, the process of getting there, including the 8-fold path of Patanjali, Ashtanga Yoga. Third, extraordinary thoughts, extraordinary knowledge, powers, experiences on the way, Vibhuti Pada. Second is Sadhan Pada. Third is Vibhuti Pada. Fourth is Kaivalya Pada. The deeper working of the mind and the establishment of state of Samadhi or Kaivalya. And as I said, there are different states of Samadhi, and Kaivalya is one particular form of it, one of the deeper parts of Samadhi. And Kaivalya is the goal for the Jaina system and many other systems also. So as I said before, Samadhi is not one thing, but what we call enlightenment are different experiences, not thousands of them, but a few of them. We see almost 5 to 7 different types of states which have been called as states of enlightenment by masters. And we said there was a state of no thought, there was a state of stillness, there is a state of no thought, there is a state of experience of the psychic being, a state of Kaivalya, a state of Nirvana, a state of experiencing oneness with universe, and there is a state of getting lost into the inertia, which should not be called as a Samadhi. But of all these states, Kaivalya is one of them. And Patanjali puts it as a goal state, Samadhi. Thank you.